Good afternoon, Minister Freeland. My name is Eva Krajewska, and I'm counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Minister Freeland, I'd like to start off with going back to your testimony in chief with respect to the Ambassador Bridge. If I understand your testimony correctly, you stated that the blockage of the Ambassador Bridge escalated matters in your mind significantly. That's fair?
So first of all, good afternoon, Ms. Krajewska. Nice, well, maybe I shouldn't say nice.
Maybe you can tell me that later.
Yeah, but good afternoon, and I will try to answer your questions. And I think when you say testimony, you're referring to the
your
2
exchange
hours
with Ms.
this morning.
Chowdhury.
So try to be precise, yes, as finance minister, in my judgment around the economic impact of the illegal blockades and occupation, certainly the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge was a very significant escalation.
Right, and precisely the words you just used now, it was at least at that point, if not earlier, that to your mind, the blockades and the demonstrations became illegal.
No, I don't think I want to be so precise about that. What I am very clear about is the blockade of the bridge made this a real economic crisis for Canada. And that was a moment when, as finance minister, I really had to figure out a way to stop the harm to Canada from getting worse and from really snowballing and irreparably damaging our country.
And you said because it had potentially exponential harm to the Canadian economy.
Yes, that I mean, I wasn't taking notes of what I said, but I believe that.
Yes. And that's when you started looking at the Bank Act and the PCLMFTA as potential, using the measures under that legislation to stop those demonstrations. Again,
here, let me be sort of very precise about my state of mind. From my perspective, we had a number of different, but certainly inspired by one another, occupations and blockades across the country. There was the occupation of Ottawa, and I can't tell you the chronology of them. I'm sure you're familiar with them. But so there's the occupation of Ottawa, there was Coutts, there was Emerson. In terms of economic impact, the Ambassador Bridge was the most significant. There was also, I believe, Sarnia, Niagara, and Surrey. So from my perspective, what was happening was this kind of metastasizing, whack-a-mole, copycat events around the country. And some of them had a greater specific economic impact than others. The Ambassador Bridge sort of stepped up the impact, but it was not the case, in my view, that this was just the Ambassador Bridge.
Okay. And that was not the purpose of my question, that it was only about the Ambassador Bridge. I understand your evidence that the blockades generally had a significant economic impact on Canada that you were concerned about. That's fair.
Again, can I say yes and offer an explanation?
I'm not trying to make this controversial or to trap you.
Well,
I'm just trying to establish this to move on to my next point.
Okay. Well, I would just say you are a lawyer, so a person does have to be careful.
Yeah.
And I say that with the greatest respect for all the lawyers who are here. But look, the point that I just want to be clear about, and I do think that there has been in some of the public thinking about this a lack of clarity, is, from my perspective, one way that you could look at the economic harm was what happens every day arithmetically and just add it up. From my perspective, that grossly understates the potential economic harm that was being done. Because what I was really worried about was that as this goes on, every single hour, more damage is done to American confidence in us as a trading partner, and more damage is done to us as an investment destination. Witness the Banana Republic comment.
Right, and exactly. So you were concerned that this economic disruption was painting Canada as politically unstable, not a place that is safe to invest for, and potentially a Banana Republic, which by definition is an unstable country.
I mean, Banana Republic wasn't my term, but it was a term that had an impact on me for sure.
Okay. Now, Minister Freeland, you can appreciate that from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, our concern is that the Emergencies Act should not be used to quash political dissent. You understand that?
I totally do. And if I can be personal for one moment, in my life as a person and a writer and an elected politician, I would always prefer for myself to be on the same side as the Civil Liberties Association. That these are values I hold very dear. And so I understand the urgency with which you champion them.
Right. So I think you would also agree that the Emergencies Act should not be used because demonstrators are disagreeing with government policy. I think that's a very low threshold here that I'm putting to you.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
And I think you also know in your life, both as a journalist and as a minister, that on occasion, the right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression includes actions that are of civil disobedience.
I do recognize that sometimes happens. And I also recognize that laws are enforced against people committing acts of civil disobedience. People can believe in something and can bravely commit those acts and pay the price of the legal penalty. And
exactly. And civil disobedience will on occasion also involve serious economic disruption. And I'll give you a few examples. A general strike is a form of civil disobedience that causes economic disruption. You'd agree with that?
If the tendency of these questions is to equate the economic harm that was being done to Canada and that would have risen had these illegal occupations and blockades continued with the harm done by a general strike, then I strongly disagree.
Okay. And sometimes blockades by Indigenous people cause economic harm, correct?
They do.
And sometimes occupations like Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Toronto may cause economic harm.
Certainly, but the economic harm, to take those two specific instances, very, very limited actually compared to the damage being done to Canada. And if I may, had what was happening in Canada been about, I don't know, the field behind the National Art Gallery being occupied for a long time, and maybe some comparable public park in Windsor being occupied, and so on across the country, that would have been entirely legitimate protest. But that wasn't what was happening.
Okay, maybe I can take you to an example closer to home. For me, when Solidarity had a general strike in Poland and blocked the ports, Western democracies applauded that action. That was economic disruption was viewed as a legitimate form of political protest at that time.
I'm going to allow myself one personal comment, which is I did make a bet with myself that you and I would end up talking about Solidarność.
Yeah, you know, coming from the Eastern Bloc, it was going to happen.
Yeah, I am aware of that. And I don't think you'll be surprised to think that I thought about that at the time. And more recently and more specifically, I thought about the Maidan in Ukraine. And when we took this action. And let me talk about a few differences. And the main one is this. Solidarność, as you know very well, was a protest against a government that was illegitimate. That was from whence it drew its power and legitimacy. This was people rising up against an authoritarian, and I would even say in the case of Poland, colonial regime. Okay. In Canada, what happened was a democratically elected government that was actually acting on policies that we had campaigned on just that summer. So it was a fresh democratic mandate. There was no lack of transparency with the people of Canada. And people who disagreed with those policies were holding the country's economy hostage. Okay, and that was not appropriate.
I do want to raise a concern. I'm assuming you're not saying that democracy only operates at the time of casting our ballot. Obviously, I think you acknowledge that we are able to protest in between those times. So even after you were democratically elected, people could protest your government's policies, correct?
100%. And I am in no way suggesting that the act of protest is anti-democratic. On the contrary, the right to protest, I think it's a feature, not a bug of democracy. But what I was saying, which I believe very strongly, is there is a big difference between acts of popular resistance and even revolution against an authoritarian regime and protest in a democracy.
And Minister Freeland, I'd like to just take you to, you started your comments this morning as well with the bigger geopolitical issues here between President Putin trying to demonstrate that his way of dictatorships is preferable to Western democracies. And one, I think you can appreciate that there have been countries in the world that have said, you should invest in us because we are politically stable. We do not have general strikes. We do not tolerate dissent. And I want to end on this. Surely you agree that in Canada, which is a democracy, the right to protest, the right to demonstration must be sedulously protected, and that economic security does not trump those rights.
So many things packed in there.
I know. I'm running out of time, so it's all going in.
So many things packed in there, and many of them I agree with. I have reported on a lot of authoritarian regimes that spoke about their stability as something that should be attractive to investors. And clearly, I strongly disagree with that argument. My concern when it came to the economic security of Canada was about our ability not to not have political debate. Political debate is a sign of a healthy society. The fact we're having this commission, that's a healthy democracy. The fact that in question period we yell at each other. I really don't like it, but it's a sign of a healthy democracy. What was undermining of Canada's economic security sufficiently dangerously that I believe we needed to act and it was the right thing to do was that our trade was being stopped and was being seriously blocked. And I was very worried that that was handing arguments to US protectionists who were already on the move, and that had that relationship been seriously damaged, that would really hurt Canada.
And Minister Freeland, my last point, you mentioned at some point that it would have been one thing for the protesters to stand with a placard at the War Museum and protest. You mentioned that today in testimony with me.
I didn't say War Museum and I didn't say placard.
Sorry.
But the basic idea, I think we're in the same zone.
I'm thinking of a different Ottawa monument. But you agree that public assembly and the right to protest goes beyond simply me standing on a green lawn in front of a government building, that it does encompass more than that, and that Canada should protect that to be a vibrant democracy.
I, am not going to right now try to define with you specifically, what is, give examples of protests. But what I will say, and I really agree with, and I think one of the lines that were very much in my mind in this decision is I do agree with you that in a democracy, the right to protest is important and has to be protected. And yeah, that's such an obvious statement, and I agree with that. And I agree, so since it's obvious, I'll say it and I won't gild the lily.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Commissioner Rouleau.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. I don't know if the Canadian Constitution Foundation wants to start or...
Lunch, but I'm in your hands.
I don't know. I think we'll adjourn for lunch. How's that?
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we'll come back then at 2 o'clock. Now, I think we can go to the next, which is the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and you're online. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, Minister. My name is Janani Shanmuganathan, and I am counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation. And today in your evidence, you talked about the economic and financial consequences of the protests. You talked about the reputational damage to Canada as an investment destination. And at the end of Commission Counsel's examination, she asked you to explain how you understood this, economic harm was linked to national security. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
All right. And your answer to that was you believe our security as a country is built on economic security. And if our economic security is threatened, all of our security is threatened. And now I'm not asking you to elaborate on this. I just want you to confirm that this was your evidence.
Obviously, I don't have word by word recall of what I said, but that's what I believe. And sounds like you're reading the transcript. So,
all right. Thank you very much. And now I take it that in order to declare a public order emergency pursuant to the Emergencies Act, there must be what's called threats to the security of Canada. You're aware of that?
Yes, I am.
And the Emergency Act says that threats to the security of Canada has the meaning assigned by Section 2 of the CSIS Act. You're aware of that?
Yes, I am.
All right, so I just want to take you to Section 2 of the CSIS Act, and this is COM, either 5 zeros or 6 zeros 935. It should be 5 zeros. If I can take to page 8, please. Perfect. If you can just pause there. So the CSIS Act defines threats to the security of Canada. And we've heard evidence in this commission that for the purposes of invoking the Emergencies Act here, the focus was on C. That's where they were focused on in terms of the threats to the security of Canada. So what C says is activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state. So you see that?
I do.
All right. And so in terms of the economic harm that you've described today, the reputational damage to Canada as, an investment country, you'll agree that it doesn't fall within C, right? The activities relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence. Would you agree with that, or is that fair to say?
Not precisely. If the direction of these questions is to ask me, did I believe we were acting within legal authorities granted by the Emergencies Act, if that's where this question is leading, then my answer is yes, I believed we had the authority to do what we did. And I hope no one is surprised by my saying that. Had I not believed it, I would not have done it, and I wouldn't be here speaking, with sadness, but confidence that we did the right thing.
So my question was whether the economic harm that you've described today falls within the definition found in C, which speaks specifically to the support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state. Does the economic harm you've described today fall within C?
It's a big question, and so I was offering an answer in several parts. And I offered the first part of it, and I can continue if you'd like.
No, I mean to be respectful. I just want to know, I appreciate that your position is that Canada acted within lawful authority to invoke the Emergencies Act, but I just want to understand if the economic harm that we spent a lot of today talking about, whether that falls within the scope of C. And so I just want to know your answer to that question.
And I also really do want to be respectful and answer this really important question. But it's a big question, so I'm going to have to take it in stages. And I offered the first stage. I can carry on if you'd like.
Sure.
So that was my first stage. Second stage is in terms of, one of the things that this commission is, I think, quite rightly investigating, was the government acting within its authorities? For me, as finance minister, an important factor in the judgment I came to, which is that we were, was the expert advice that we received. I'm not a lawyer. I rely on the judgment of officials who advised us, and on expert legal advice. And I say that even as I am very confident that it was the right decision and confident in taking personal political responsibility. I can also speak to what I saw and experienced and believed that falls within the scope of the serious violence against persons or property point. But I do want to be clear that I'm not speaking here as someone with an expert legal opinion, but I'm speaking as a minister who made a political judgment and as someone who was also in Ottawa. So some of the things that factored into my thinking about it were, as I described in my testimony this morning, a real concern that we were in a tinderbox situation where the economic threats and the threats generally that and the damage that were being created both by the Ottawa occupation and the Ambassador Bridge did risk, I felt, at every moment, some kind of conflict between protesters and counter-protesters. I saw that and experienced it myself, just being a person who was in Ottawa. I felt it was a tinder keg that could be sparked at any moment and was therefore very dangerous. And although I didn't see it myself, I heard accounts of Windsor of a situation there, which I found to be very credible. I was also influenced, can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Which speaks to this. I was also influenced by our IRG meeting on, I think it was the Saturday, the 12th, where we heard from the RCMP commissioner about concerns that there were serious weapons in Coutts. And that really raised the stakes in terms of my degree of concern about what could be happening there, but also what could be happening in this sort of whack-a-mole copycat situation across the country.
Okay, so my question was about how you understood the economic harms to fall within subsection or C, the definition of threats to security of Canada in C. And as I understand your explanation is it falls within it because there's a risk that the economic harm that's being created by the protests could somehow manifest into actual threats of violence. Is that your understanding of how it falls within C?
I'm going to object to the question as phrased. That's a legal question.
I'm just trying to find out she's offered an explanation for how she says the economic harm falls within C, and she linked it directly to the threats or use of acts. And I'm just trying to understand what that link is.
I mean, my counsel may have something to say, but I don't think that's a fair characterization of what I said just now or of what I said this morning. What I think is fair is, first of all, that I relied on expert legal judgment to make a very important and weighty legal decision. What I also said is, as a person who was here in Ottawa, I did see a real danger of violence. And then finally, what I described in my testimony this morning was the way in which the economic security of our country, I really believe, is a part of our national security. But that was a much broader conversation we were having about a broad set of issues, which I certainly think are important for us to think about and consider.
And I don't want to mischaracterize your evidence. Just so that we're all clear, do you see a link between the economic harm that you say was caused by the protests to Canada with what's contained in C in terms of the threats or use of acts of serious violence against persons?
And again there, I really do not want to shirk my personal political responsibility. And while this was a grave and serious decision, we took it carefully and thoughtfully, and I believed it was the right decision then, and I believe today it is the right decision. But I'm also conscious, if I may continue.
Of course.
I'm also conscious that I am not a lawyer, and I'm not a person who can give expert opinion on the precise parsing of these authorities. It was important for me to be assured that we did have the authority to act, and I received, as a cabinet member, assurances that we had those authorities from people who I believe were qualified to offer those assurances.
And I don't mean to belabor the point. I just want to make sure the evidence is clear. So your evidence is that you understood that you had the authority to invoke the Emergencies Act, but in terms of saying there's a linkage between the economic harm caused by the protests with the requirement of the threat or use of acts of serious violence, is that something that you can't speak to?
Again, Commissioner, this is a legal interpretation question that will be addressed in closing submissions.
And I don't mean to belabor this. I just want to make sure I understand Deputy Minister's evidence. Is she just saying that she can't comment on it because it's a legal question, or she's saying that there is a link? I just want to know what the answer is.
I renew my objection and would ask for a ruling on it.
Okay, well, I think at the end of the day, I don't think you can pursue this any further at the moment. I think you've got your answer, and as it is.
That's fine. Thank you very much. I don't know how much time I have left, but I do have just one other point I'd like to, or one other issue to address, if I may. So when we were talking about FinTrack this morning, and you explored it as one option to pursue, but decided that, making a change to it, the legislative amendment would take too much time. Do you recall your evidence earlier today about that?
Yes, I do.
All right. And so just so that we're all clear, because we have Canadians watching who may not understand the process, the Proceeds of Crime and Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act, it gives the ability to create regulations, right?
If your question is, was it possible to grant FinTrack, to give FinTrack these expanded powers through regulation, that is correct. And I said that this morning. We did go on to grant those powers through regulation.
And there's just a difference between how regulations are passed versus, say, example, legislation or amendments to legislation. The latter is what you have to do, the 3 readings, going to Senate. It's a much longer legislative process. That's fair?
100%.
And by comparison, passing regulations is a much shorter process.
Absolutely.
Okay, those are all my questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next is the Democracy Fund, JCCF.
Good afternoon, Minister. My name is Alan Honor. I'm a lawyer at the Democracy Fund, and we share status with the JCCF and Citizens for Freedom. Ms. Freeland, in your witness statement, you mentioned challenges to supply chains as being a major focus for you in January of 2022, but you didn't mention the government vaccine mandate for truckers, and I'd just like to ask you a little bit about that. Can we please pull up OTT 3027621.0001. And Ms. Freeland, while we're waiting for that to come up, this is a letter which is addressed to you and other ministers by the Canadian Trucking Alliance, and it's dated December 10th, 2021. I'd like to take you through part of this letter, but before I do that, can you tell me, do you know who this group is, the Canadian Trucker Alliance?
I can't say I'm familiar with them right now. Maybe I've heard of them, but.
Okay, well, I think we've heard some evidence about them, but if you're not familiar with them, that's okay. Let's just go down to the first paragraph here. And Ms. Freeland, I just want to read this to you. It says that the Canadian Trucker Alliance is disappointed to learn that our current exemption from the national vaccination mandate is being removed, considering the immense impact this decision will have on already beleaguered supply chains. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, and if I can take you to another part of that letter, just on the second page, second paragraph, please. Here we see CTA estimates that combined, the proposed vaccine mandate for cross-border truck drivers and the federal sector mandate announced by the Minister of Labour would remove between 15,000 and 30,000 Canadian drivers from the interprovincial and international supply chains. The expected loss of transportation service capacity will trigger significant ripple effects throughout the entire economy. And Ms. Freeland, I just want to ask you, this is something you knew about when the exemption for truckers was removed in February. You knew that this might have some effect on the supply chain. Is that fair?
I knew that some people asserted that it might.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to suggest, this is not the first time this group wrote to you. If we can scroll down to page 5, please. We have another letter, just to the top of page 5. Sorry, it might be page 4. Just go up, please. Okay, so here we have a letter. It is a little bit down, please. I'm sorry. Can we just go to the top? So December the 8th, 2021. And if we can scroll down to the second paragraph, it says here, when the mandate was originally announced, CTA expected that upwards of 20% of the 120,000 Canadian truck drivers crossing the US-Canada border would have likely remained unvaccinated by January 2022. Of the 40,000 US-based truck drivers crossing the border, CTA estimated that upwards of 40% of these drivers would not be prepared to meet the vaccine mandate requirement. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay, and just one last question about this. You would agree that the reduction of truck drivers crossing the border when there are already supply chain issues could have an effect on the economy?
I don't agree with the estimates that are provided there. And
Okay.
I don't agree with the assertion that the vaccine mandates themselves caused problems for our supply chain.
But they affected it. They had a contribution to that supply chain problem.
No, I don't agree with that.
Okay,
The
let's scroll
vast
down.
majority of Canadian truckers are, in fact, and were at the time vaccinated and supported the vaccine mandates.
Okay, well, let's go to page 6, please. Okay, in the first paragraph that we see there, the CTA is giving stats that truckers move about 70% of the $648 billion Canada-US trade. Does that sound about right to you?
Again, I can't
You have no
say
reason to
whether
disagree
that's
with it, though.
true or not, but I have no reason to. Let me say this. Trucking is very important for the Canadian economy. Trucking is very important for our supply chains, and trucking is very important for cross-border trade. That I am very prepared to agree with.
I think we can all agree on that. And let's just consider that if what the Canadian if what the CTA is saying is correct, and the drivers are reduced by 20%, that's a reduction of 24,000 trucks in the supply chain.
The challenge here for me is I disagree with the fundamental premise. And this was something that was looked at carefully by Minister Alghabra and also by the Minister of Health.
Okay, so you disagree with the fundamental premise of the Canadian Trucker Alliance. Thank you. I'll move on to something else. I just want to understand a little bit more about what was going on in January. And you gave some evidence today, and I think you told us that it was a very intense month for you. That would be fair?
Yes, that would be fair.
Okay, and let me make sure that I understand it. So on the one hand, you were preparing a budget.
Yes.
Okay, and there was the issue of the Build Back Better legislation in the States, and there was the electric vehicle tax credit, right? That was on your plate.
Not solely on mine, but it was something I was working on.
Right. And there was the COVID recovery, and there were local and global supply chain issues.
Yes.
Okay. And there was the looming threat of inflation.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about the Ukraine, and I think you said that was the biggest threat to national security since World War II.
The Russian invasion.
The Russian invasion.
When it actually happened, yes, I think that is the biggest security challenge, national security challenge our country has faced.
And it was on your radar in January.
Yes, it was.
Okay. And in the midst of this, there was this trucker protest of unprecedented proportions taking place across the country, and you described that as whack-a-mole.
No, what I would describe as what we saw happening from the moment that the initial occupation began is copycat protests happening across the country, and that posed a particular national challenge.
I see. I thought you said the word whack-a-mole, but it's not important. But what is important, I would put to you, is that the U.S. was unhappy with the situation in Canada, and they were seeing their own vulnerability in our supply chains. That was your evidence, was it not?
Certainly.
And they didn't like that.
The, in particular, blockade of the Ambassador Bridge exposed the vulnerability of the U.S. economy, particularly the car sector, to the Canadian car sector.
Exactly. And I put it to you, Minister, that the government felt that they had to do something about these protests, not because of threats of serious violence, but because your government was completely overwhelmed and you were under a tremendous amount of pressure from the United States.
I absolutely disagree with that.
Okay, well, we heard evidence from you earlier today, and you said that you were put into contact with Brian Dees. So he's the economic advisor to the president. He's a very influential player in the decision for the electric vehicle tax credit issue, and he actually contacted you.
That's correct.
Right? And you thought that it was striking that someone of his importance, who's so hard to get a hold of, contacted you.
I had spoken to Brian Dees before and since, but the speed and urgency with which he got in touch with me was definitely significant and relevant.
And he was unhappy, and there could be major economic consequences.
What he said to me, as I reported in that readout, was that they were very concerned that because of the blockades, U.S. factories would shut down.
Right, and we heard that the CEOs of two major banks contacted you, Canadian banks, I believe. And we also heard that President Biden, who's probably the world's most powerful person, or near that, had a telephone call with the Prime Minister.
Yes, both of those things are true.
And that telephone call, it happened on a Friday, and by the Monday, the Emergencies Act was invoked.
That's true.
Okay, and so I put it to you, Minister, that the federal government had to show the USA that they were in control, and that explains why the Emergencies Act was invoked, despite the fact that, for example, the Ambassador Bridge was cleared and open to traffic?
No, I wouldn't agree with that characterization.
Okay, well, I would put it to you that the pressure the government was under explains why the Emergencies Act was invoked, despite the fact that a deal had been struck with the protesters in Ottawa to reduce the footprint of the protest in that city.
Again, I would disagree with that.
Well, let's see if you would agree with this. I'd put it to you that there was no meaningful consultation with the provinces, not even advance notice of what the First Minister's meeting was about. And that's because the government didn't have time for it. They just had to make a decision about the Emergencies Act because of the tremendous pressure that they were under.
Again, I disagree with a great deal of that characterization.
One last question for you then, Ms. Freeland. I put it to you that given the overwhelming situation that the government was facing explains why they were willing to use extraordinary powers against their own people, despite the fact that no police agency or intelligence agency told them that there were threats to the security of Canada.
Again, I disagree with many of the premises in that question, and I would be happy to elaborate, but it seems that we're out of time.
Seems so. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Okay,